Okay, so you guys sent us in a ton of stuff about salt this time.
Yeah.
We've got articles, we've got a long briefing document, some FAQs, even a timeline, it looks like,
Yeah.
all about salt and health. And
Exactly.
you know what it does in our bodies?
Hmm.
So we are going to do our best to make sense of it all for you
Right.
and cut through, all the maybe conflicting information and really get down to what are the important insights here.
Yeah. Looking at it all, it really seems like, what we thought about salt and what it does for our health has really changed a lot
It really has.
over the years.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, it's not just a simple less is always better message
Right.
anymore.
Right. And that's what jumped out at me is
Yeah.
the research has been really, eye-opening the last couple of years. So
Yeah.
I'm excited to dive in. And where do we even begin with this?
Well, I think maybe a good place to start is like, where did this advice about salt reduction, where did it come from?
Yeah.
We've heard for so long about reducing our salt intake. Like, there's a reason for that, right?
Yeah.
And for a long time, major health organizations like the World Health Organization, WHO, they were really pushing for low salt intake.
Right. They've said less than 5 grams of salt per day, which is about 2 grams of sodium.
Exactly.
So what was the thinking there? Like, what was the main reason behind that advice?
Well, the main concern was that there seemed to be this link, this direct link between how much salt you eat and your chances of developing high blood pressure,
Okay.
which we call hypertension.
Right.
And that can lead to all sorts of cardiovascular problems.
Heart disease and stroke, all that stuff.
Exactly. And I mean, this wasn't just based on, a hunch or something.
Right.
All of the sources talk about all this research that went into this, connecting high sodium levels to hypertension.
Yeah. Substantial research, it says.
Exactly.
Yeah, this wasn't just like a casual suggestion.
No, it was really serious. And they even had these estimates saying that millions of deaths every year globally
Wow.
were linked to eating too much sodium.
So that was sort of the prevailing wisdom for a while.
Yeah, that's right. For a long time, it was pretty clear, it should reduce your salt intake and protect your heart.
Right. And then it seems like things started to shift in like 2018.
Yeah.
Like there's something about 2018 that was a turning point.
Yeah, it seemed like that was when this big study came out, this huge study with like 94,000 people
Wow.
in 18 different countries.
Okay.
And that really kind of started to challenge this idea of a direct, more salt equals more risk model.
Okay. Well, that's a huge study.
Yeah.
So what did they find? What was so important about that?
Well, what they found was that for most people, consuming less than that 5 grams of salt per day that the WHO recommended, it didn't actually reduce their health risks. And actually, the increased risks were mostly happening when people ate way more sodium than that, particularly in developed countries. So for you, that would be like the U.S.
Okay.
So, so it seems like that idea that you have to drastically cut your salt intake
Yeah.
to be healthier maybe wasn't the whole story.
Interesting. Okay. So if lowering salt intake wasn't necessarily reducing the risks for most people, what started to emerge as like a new model?
Well, this is where this idea of a J-shaped curve comes in.
J-shaped curve.
Oh, okay.
So I need you to explain that.
Yeah.
Because we're not looking at a graph here.
Okay, so imagine like a graph.
Yeah.
And on one side, you've got really low salt intake.
Yeah.
And there's some level of risk there.
Okay.
And as you move towards like a moderate salt intake, the risk dips down.
Okay.
And that's the bottom of the J.
Okay.
But then as you go up to really high salt intake, the risk starts to go back up again.
Okay.
So it forms this J shape.
So what you're saying is there are potentially risks at both ends of the spectrum.
Right.
Like too little salt and too much salt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they talked about this in the sources.
Okay.
On the really low end, if you're eating less than like 2 grams of sodium per day,
Yeah.
there's this thing called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system
Okay.
that can get activated.
Break that down for me.
It's kind of like your body's system for regulating blood pressure and fluid balance.
Yeah.
So when your sodium gets super low, this system kind of kicks into overdrive.
Huh?
And while it's trying to like regulate everything, it can actually cause some negative side effects.
Like what?
Well, like it can increase your plasma lipids,
Okay.
which are fats in your blood. And some research even suggests it could increase your risk of dying.
Oh, wow.
And the briefing even said that it can trigger these like negative hormonal responses.
Okay.
So it seems like our bodies actually need a certain amount of sodium to function properly.
Right.
And going too low can really mess things up.
It's like a Goldilocks situation.
Yeah, exactly.
Too much, too little. Just Right.
Right.
Okay, so that's the low end. What about the high end? We've always heard about the dangers of too much salt.
Yeah, and those are still valid, especially for some people.
Okay.
If you're consistently eating a lot of sodium, more than that 5-gram threshold we talked about,
Yes.
it can lead to higher blood pressure in people who are susceptible to that. And that can increase their risk of cardiovascular problems like heart attacks and strokes.
Okay, so it's not like a free-for-all to start adding tons of salt
Right.
to your food.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So
Indeed.
who are the people who should be extra careful about their salt intake?
Well, the sources were pretty clear on this. People with pre-existing conditions like high blood pressure
Okay.
or heart problems, they should definitely watch their salt intake.
That makes sense.
Yeah, because extra sodium can make those conditions worse, and that puts them at even higher risk.
Right. So for them, it's like the old advice still stands.
Exactly.
Okay. But for healthy adults, what's the latest thinking on what's a healthy amount of salt?
Well, based on all the new research, it seems like a moderate intake of sodium, somewhere between 3 and 5 grams a day,
Okay.
is probably safe and maybe even the best for a lot of people.
Okay, so that's pretty specific.
Mm-hmm.
What's the reasoning behind that?
Well, it seems like that range gives your body enough sodium to do what it needs to do
Right.
without pushing you into the danger zone where you're at higher risk for those problems we talked about.
Okay, but there's a really important caveat in the briefing document.
Right.
It said, this is all contingent on overall diet quality and individual health status.
Exactly. It's not a one-size-fits-all recommendation, and that's really important to remember.
Right.
Like, how much salt is right for you depends on a lot of things.
That's
Your
right.
diet, overall, your health.
Yeah, your lifestyle.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the heart health stuff, but there was something in the sources about salt and something beyond just heart health.
Yeah, they're starting to look at a possible connection between salt intake and cognitive function.
Cognitive function, you mean like our brain.
Yeah, exactly. Like how well our brains work, or,
Yeah.
our thinking, our memory, all of that.
Okay, how could salt be related to that?
Well, one of the studies talked about this idea that as we get older, our sense of taste can decline.
Okay.
And some people might start adding more salt to their food to make it taste stronger. And that might actually be connected to cognitive problems later on.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a new area of research, so we don't know for sure.
Right, but it is a really fascinating link.
It is, yeah, and it just goes to show that something as simple as salt can have effects we never even thought about.
Yeah. Okay, so another big piece of this puzzle is potassium.
Right.
It keeps coming up in the sources.
Yeah, it's not just about how much sodium you eat. It seems like potassium is really important too.
So how does that work? What does potassium do?
Well, research suggests that eating foods rich in potassium can actually help offset some of the negative effects of sodium,
Okay.
even if you're eating a bit more sodium than you should.
So things like bananas, sweet potatoes, leafy greens, all that.
Exactly. Those are all good sources of potassium, and it seems like getting enough of it can protect you in some ways.
So it's almost like sodium and potassium have opposite effects on our bodies.
Yeah, it does seem that way. Potassium helps regulate your blood pressure, which is one of the big problems with too much sodium. And there's even some evidence that potassium can lower your risk of cardiovascular disease.
Okay, so again, it comes back to that balance.
Exactly. It's not just about cutting one thing out. It's about making sure you're getting enough of the good stuff, too.
Right. Okay, so shifting gears a bit, the sources also talked about the WHO's efforts to reduce salt intake globally.
Right. They've been trying to get everyone to eat less salt for years.
Yeah, they set a goal of a 30% reduction by 2025.
Exactly. But according to a WHO report that came out in 2025, it doesn't seem like we're on track to meet that goal.
Really?
Yeah, only a small number of countries have actually done what they need to do to lower sodium levels.
Wow, so what are the big roadblocks here? Why is it so hard to get people to eat less salt?
One of the main problems is processed foods.
Okay.
They are loaded with sodium, and a lot of people get most of their sodium from processed foods.
Right, and it's so hard to avoid.
Exactly. You can try to control how much salt you add at home.
Yeah.
But if you're eating a lot of processed foods, it's really hard to keep your sodium intake down.
It's almost like it's out of your control.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so one of the things that caught my eye in the 2025 research was this idea that maybe some of the older research on salt had some problems.
Oh, yeah. There were some concerns about the methods they used to estimate how much sodium people were actually eating.
Okay, so how does that affect things?
Well, it means that some of the links between high salt intake and heart problems might not be as strong as we thought.
Huh.
Yeah, if they weren't measuring sodium intake accurately, then some of their conclusions might be off.
Wow. So it's almost like we're back to square one.
In a way, yeah, but not really. We've learned so much more about salt in the last few years.
That's true.
And we've gone from this simple idea of salt is bad to this more nuanced understanding that it's really about balance.
Right. Like too much is still a problem,
Yeah,
but a moderate amount seems to be okay.
exactly. And we know that potassium is really important too, and we're still learning new things like this possible connection with cognitive function.
Yeah, this has been a really interesting look at something that most of us probably don't think about too much.
I know, right? It's amazing how something so common can be so complex.
Yeah, well, hopefully this has given you, our listener, a better understanding of all the latest science on salt.
Right, and maybe it'll make you think twice about how much salt you're using.
And maybe check out the potassium content of your favorite foods.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance.
Right, and taking care of your health.
Exactly.
All right, well, thanks for listening,
Thanks for having me.
and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
Bye.